Welcome. My name is Anselm Franke, and I am a curator and writer. My institutional base is the HKW, Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, where I work as head of the visual arts and film department in charge of the exhibition program. And I'm talking to Alexandra Anikina, who is an artist, filmmaker, and educator, who in her work explores questions of technology, human agency, memory, ecology, and more generally, one could say, the entry of digital culture into film, into moving images. She's been working with algorithmic means and moving into a genre that she's calling procedural films. And we will talk about that as well, but this is actually not the work that you were doing for or during the residency at Digital Earth. Is a different project, right? It's a project that is exploring many of these themes that I've kind of tagged so far, but it is in a way more of an essayistic exploration, exploring both grand schemes of history, of historical narration, of memory, and your own family history. So Alex, maybe you can talk a little bit about Data Field, the project that you have completed now and shown in April this year. Mm-hmm. And that was supported by the residency.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. Let me share my screen so I can share some visuals of this film. So indeed, Data Field led me onto a very interesting path that I'm going to talk to you about. Essentially, it started as an exploration into technology and into ideas of how technology, or rather how modernity remains in contemporary technologies, in our contemporary digital culture, and what kind of ghosts of modernity ideas of man and of life and of work remain even in the contemporary software, which is where this project is going. So essentially, Data Field is going to be a 3-part film, and the first part is what I completed now. But the thing is, to research this, I started with my family history. Yeah, I'm grateful to have grandparents who are still alive and who were born in. My grandma was born in 1929, and my grandpa in 1935. So this film then, for me, was kind of it turned into a kind of a ritual, how to access the past that I feel I feel like a continuation of. That it also started with this material entry into these places where they've been, and also immaterial places. So let me take you through maybe a few locations, that I discovered on this journey. So all of this started with this wooden house in a village called Chichova, which is near a city called Kolomna, where I was born, and where my great-grandpa, so the dad of my grandfather, Anatoly, built a wooden house in 1918, just 1 year after the revolution. And somehow this wooden house persisted through time, to this day. And this house for me became the starting point for thinking about how some of the Soviet ghosts persist and others are selectively, for example, promoted by the current government. Some are selectively erased. and somehow the whole exploration of this late 1920s, late 1930s transition from the agricultural space towards this very future-oriented Soviet space of technology started me on this thinking of how technology in public rhetoric was visualized, was even materialized somehow for the people who were not used to this kind of temporality. For example, yeah, I'll show you this.
Right.
This kind of mix of visuals that I was very interested in. There's very traditional style of folk art, but it features completely contemporary characters. A man in a suit, the man, the organizer from the party, telling the people how the land should be, properly governed and conquered and made efficient. So this clash of temporalities for me was very, very interesting somehow.
I think you speak in the film. Sorry.
No, go on.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I'm just interested to hear you maybe, because I think that is obviously a very major topic of the whole film, but you kind of introduce it as this kind of gap, or existing in the gap of temporal models, no, of assumed stable temporal structures, but existing somehow outside of them, as if in a kind of liminal temporal model in which there's also a kind of ungrounded time. So the aspirational time of the future to which the Soviet communist project is oriented as one that always will have to be realized, and a reality that sort of is always, as you call it in the voiceover, lagging. And then you say that you also feel that your grandparents, your parents lived in this gap, although you have hardly experienced the Soviet reality. You say in the film, as the author, whose autobiographical data field is partially explored in this film, that you also feel having been born into this gap. And I wonder if you could explain why is it the same, and why is it different for you than for those who actually built or lived in the Soviet temporal gap, as you describe it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's the same in the sense that as my grandma said something that kind of stayed with me a little bit. She said that she had a sense of purpose when she was leaving. So comparing her experience in the Soviet Union and after its collapse, she said that back then she had a sense of purpose, which she lost. So I kind of see her still living in a. She was born in a constant kind of striving for this progress, the futuristic paradise somehow, and she was happy in building it, which is something that's very hard, I think, to access in contemporary times. It's very hard to imagine, even for me.
Yeah.
And she was completely also at the same time distanced. So she distanced herself from all of the traumatic memories, so all of the repression, all of the real problematic things that went on in Soviet past. So for her, she had to live in this gap in order to kind of realize herself. And it's interesting because for me, I also feel I'm living in a kind of a forced gap between the life the life I'm living under capitalism, because I think the supposed lack of ideologies is really, really, like Mark Fisher says, not true. Yeah, that capitalism came and liberated us all from the perils of belief. Yeah, that I think that's something that also prompted me to think about it in this film. That there is still a very much gap, a very big gap between these narratives of futurity and the current contemporary situation, I think, which was made even more visible in recent 2 years. So while our experiences are completely different, I think there is this very major trend on how temporality is accessed through, and why currently it's like with a different sign, why so many people now are saying it's hard to imagine the future. Yeah, it's hard to it's hard to imagine the end of capitalism. Yeah, so I think there's something similar in how technology mediates this to us, and how it keeps us in a particular state where we only imagine one possible, or where we're tied to a particular type of temporality. That's why I made it as a type of a ritual of me visiting these locations. It visits this strange space-times, I guess, or maybe more times than spaces, such as the falling of Tunguska meteorite, the local museum, the cemetery where my not my grandparents, where my ancestors are lying, this village which I already introduced, and the mausoleum of Lenin, and also one very brief passage from a sci-fi novel by Brother Strugatsky, and also the archive that I went through while digging into the Soviet past. This one particular landscape, which is going to be in the next two films, the media landscape. I collected the news about asteroids that ever fell in the last decade or so near our planet, or even in Russia. The mythology, of course, is always also geopolitical somehow. It's enabled to do different, or it's appropriated maybe to do different things.
Right. Yeah, I'm interested in discussing this question of mythology in the gap, perhaps a little bit more. I mean, the way I would also phrase the transition, or this distance, generational distance, that you kind of render thematic in the film, is of course also this very kind of strict, one could perhaps say, but maybe the second film will undo the strictness of this shift between discursive frameworks. No, one sort of a discursive framework based on basically dialectical materialism, and another one based on feedback models, behaviorist and other, and of course in the feedback model, as my friend Anna Pinto has insisted many times in lectures she gave on cybernetics, etc., there is no space for antagonism, really. There is no political project really within that, and I think that's part of what the film that you made brings out very well. And there's a kind of total logic in this, why and when does one move to, as you do, to Google Earth, in the sense that somehow the incoherence that, or I had to also think when I first saw or an earlier draft of the film, I had to think of this Henri Sala work from the late 90s, where he's lip reading one of his mother's as a socialist leader in the 60s speeches, sort of where this kind of that which once made sense or cohered into a certain political project, into a certain subjectivity, no longer makes sense. No, this is why this work was in a way so paradigmatic, and your work in a way visits that very same moment, but it also shows how the coherence, like how the fact that an image can be produced at all is sort of turned into this phantasmatic space of Google Earth, no? Like that globe where actually nobody lives. In the words of Spivak, no, this it's a computer screen globe, but it's composed of this geospatial data thing. So let's say these are the two discursive frames in which this whole like very, very personal and also very, very conceptual scenario that you develop, in which the entire question of history and time errors, etc., becomes a conceptual question. But there's another layer below, right, which is when you say in front of the house, in the garden, so when you say, oh, we were reading Vladimir Prop, the great folklorist. And it's all the time there as well. No? So, and I think it's a third layer of the film. It's a third discursive framework, which is a kind of a set of cosmological economies, of cosmological relations, and perhaps even models, although that's probably too conceptual for that sort of never leave, no, like that will always sort of reappear. In this case, you mentioned the forest was linked to the dead, the garden to the living. Now, so that is a cosmological boundary, right, between life and death. And then you describe in a way how the entire Soviet project upsets any such coordinates of life and death, like the cosmological boundary. If that is one of the major things by which cosmologies are defined, where do you draw the line between life and death, and how is it maintained? What rituals are being used? But then the Cosmist project, or the mausoleum of Lenin, the entire aspirational horizon was really to work the cosmological boundary, you know, like to shift it completely, and by means of a kind of techno-heroic Prometheanism, which we know is really problematic today. This Prometheanism, because it carries a sense of a continued political project within the feedback model, into a direction that is in many instances becoming a kind of muscular neo-fascism. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about this kind of, because I know you're thinking so much about this question of an ecology of relations versus the technological fantasies, the kind of male fantasies that are invested in Promethean discourse today.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a question for the second film, because that one is going to concentrate on the women in my family, because I think this part was more about this kind of scientist who is the main protagonist of so many Soviet sci-fi novels, which I think is also very interesting, that it puts geologists, botanists, scientists of all kinds to be the main kind of hero. And there's so much written on space exploration from this standpoint. It's amazing. But it's also, I think it's very different somehow from the phallic dream of Elon Musk. When I'm now looking for models of relations that are non-hierarchical, when I'm pursuing them as how can we acknowledge our relationships to things that exist, and that capitalism makes us continuously transfer to one realm of commodity consumption, that makes me also somehow dig up these ghosts to see where exactly did it go in this direction, and what exactly maybe also Soviet modernity was taken from the West, even though it was positioning itself as everything but the West. Yeah, and where did it take from somewhere else? Cosmism is, of course, a very big influence on Soviet philosophy. I don't think I dug so much into it in the film, but it was definitely the sense that there is something that my grandparents consider as worthy pursuit somehow is also framed in this collective that they saw as they can't exist as individuals. Yeah, they have to exist as a collective. And for them, it was a different experience, which we also now lack everywhere. And also it's interesting how all of the babies that are thrown away with the water of communism as a failed socialist state, the really existing one, they are somehow being continuously discredited. We're just talking about it with another fellow, Sahaj, that the legacy of internationalism is somehow continuously, of international labor movement is continuously discredited and marginalized. So everything that follows through from that is somehow pirates or on the margins or WikiLeaks or criminals. So it's just moved away somehow inconspicuously. And I wonder about that because I think this needs to be somehow, yeah, it's if revisited and questioned in a different way, maybe.
Absolutely. Do you want to maybe speak briefly about these kind of works that are in fact perhaps more central to your overall practice, like the ones that you did in using generative algorithms in order to understand the medium film under its current, like in the way film is part of reshaping and depoliticizing, perhaps repoliticizing these cosmological boundaries today?
Yeah, let's try. I'm gonna share a screen. So my work in general also, or my project before Digital Earth that I was working for 4 years during my PhD was about procedural films, which is a term I came up with to denote this generative algorithmic moving works. And I made 2 works with that. One was a screensaver, which which basically is an algorithm which is on the screen, which plays all of the possible images in the screen of a certain resolution, in which I made into a lecture performance, which explored what happens when you stare at the screen for a while, and what is the difference between staring at a screen of pixels and the screen that has figurative images.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, and the other work I'll just very briefly introduce them. The other work was called Don't Play a Character, which was about this 18th century Indian automaton called Tipu's Tiger, which is now on view in V&A Museum, and where it actually has been in this or that form since 1833, when it was brought from India after Tipu Sultan's province. Mysore was conquered by East Indian Company. So when I was thinking about screensaver and this endless noise, I was thinking about mental imagery that exists in the mind when your brain tries to make sense of the noise. Yeah, and this is something that I saw as very opposite of seeing images as objects for consumption. Yeah, because it forces you into a structuralist, materialist film. When it forces you into this reflection, state of reflection. And maybe just seeing this agency of film is a space of intimacy and alienation at the same time. Yeah, returning back to this idea of mythologies coming from particular gaps. So this is and the resonances between the beginning of this work, of this body of work, and what I'm doing now. So this is the installation view of data field as of April this year in the Russian State Museum of Architecture. And here you can see that the objects from the film also take part in the installation.
The vitrine as well?
Well, the vitrine, yeah, the vitrine frames them. But these are basically the postcards that you saw in the film, in the box.
Amazing.
Yeah, so a particular museum gaze takes place, I guess, in terms of framing these mythologies. But this I wanted to show in juxtaposition with the example I was trying to find earlier. And the example is the contemporary, actually last year, advertisement of the main Russian bank called Sberbank, which recreates this Soviet actor, digitally recreates his face from existing film using machine learning and also his voice to bring him back to, well, forward to the future, where he's portrayed as very much in awe of the modern technologies and the media ecology of Sberbank, which I find extremely fascinating, the way how it's shown. So all of the media products of Sberbank are shown as a part of this future fantasy. And the irony, I guess, from their side is that in the original film, he traveled back in time to the time of Ivan IV, and in the current advertisement, he does the same but forward. So all of the all of the signs of contemporary capitalism are uncritically presented as as something to strive for. So yeah, and I think this is so similar in the way how these images are mixed and how their agency is just appropriated for some other means. So I guess that's my current obsession with how it's corporately captured, this affect, this wherever I called it procedural animism in the text I sent you earlier. That's, I guess, creation of these characters and weaponizing nostalgia also in this case. Yeah, because it's a very, very beloved and nostalgic film for many people still living.
Yeah, I understand.
Mm.
Can you maybe say a few words about procedural animism, because we heard procedural films, but we haven't heard procedural animism.
Yeah, so that's what I'm currently trying to think now as this potential desire for a more animate world, which and a particular type of affect which gets captured by corporate depictions of, for example, artificial intelligence, or even by this ad. And it's, for me, it's interesting because it's both something that's completely, almost overwhelmingly co-opted into the platforms, but something that exists, and I'm trying to work on how to define it further. And I think the word animism here works because of its intrinsic relationship to images and how we relate to them. I was thinking about how you defined it at some point as a particular mode of being in the media, as how we as human beings are within the media. And I think that's something that I tend to agree with, because it's for me, it's also this relationship that you build towards, also increasingly towards images, and to others through images, not through direct connection to others.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a crucial question. And I also haven't fully finished ever thinking about it in this kind of, like how a certain form of, let's say, reification, alienation, etc., not just this desire for, it's basically the problem of romanticism. It's basically the problem of romanticism, in that romanticism may end up being a kind of, expressing a certain desire for, let's say, a holistic cosmos, for an animate cosmos, for also a non-bourgeois subjectivity, but it celebrates its own mourning work at the same time, and which makes it also particularly open towards this kind of, you know, romantic anti-capitalism, which would basically be a reductionist simplification, because it's not systemically anti-capitalist. It's more like partially anti-capitalist, in the sense that there's some parts of capitalism that are opposed to, you know, true value, or to an order that we have, that whose coherence we have lost, and so on. And that, of course, becomes very open towards kind of traditionalist and even fascist ideas. The Soviet mythology that you tackle so beautifully, or, you know, in the film, and I think we once in one of our sessions also started speaking about that. I'm trying to think about it in terms of this kind of, you know, more anthropological vocabulary of, or this gap that you have indicated between sort of reality and the future, or always being in that temporal gap, is also translates in other terms. And in fact, anti-communists, particularly Catholic-leaning Western thinkers who made themselves useful to both the Catholic Church and the anti-communist project of the NATO states, they were finding these anthropological theories of that gap extremely interesting, which is like, you know, in one version translates as this form of socialism produces a kind of permanent and also frozen state of liminality, like frozen because it's kind of never really moving toward, like, it's also not fully liminal in the sense that, you know, in anthropological theories of ritual liminal states, there is, the great thing is that there is lived socialism, no? Like, because the hierarchy and status has been taken away from, is taken off your shoulders, so you feel liberated, you feel at one, you hug a stranger on the streets when you make revolution, or when you know, like, but the next morning you wake up next to someone and have a headache, like, oh my God. So between this kind of aspiration of no status, total equality, socialist future, and you know, the kind of creeping in of bureaucratization, of status, of corruption, and so strangely frozen in this in between, no, or in the schizophrenics of this moment. And that, yeah, I find mythologically very interesting, and speaks a lot to the kind of narration and the way you use these images, because you kind of also speak to a kind of, when you speak of procedural animism, it sounds to me like you speak of the politics of metamorphosis, or the politics of transformation, which is such a liminal thing, no? And of course, the liminal power that images have, they get us in touch with metamorphosis, or metamorphic processes, even of the sensory apparatus and the brain, which is all the stuff that you work on.
Yeah, through all of that, there are images that persist somehow, and they get co-opted at some point, and they co-opted in different way, another point, but they still carry this some kind of interesting charge, if you want, or something that makes you build a relationship with this very nostalgic phase, and not necessarily nostalgic for me. After all of the work I've done on this film, I think I've also built some residual trauma in my body after researching this, but nostalgic to many, and how easy it is to weaponize it, how easy it is to just take it and put it in a product like that.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, it is definitely, for me, that's very much a political project in taking it to these definitions of human, and the bots, and the continuous alienation and dehumanization that happens, like a lot of colonial theorists, right, in a position from creating difference to others. And then I kind of feel like I need to add the others, the non-human others, and also the images of non-human others there as well, the bots, all of the types of non-player characters in capitalism. All of the robotized, automated customer services, because they only keep adding to this continuous re-establishing of the human, yeah, of the nominal human. So it's interesting how one could, thinking about procedural images and animism, to turn that somehow back to freeing these agents. Maybe it's a naive kind of aspiration to free them, but it's interesting at least to see how they get co-opted and how this process of cooptation just runs invisibly.
I mean, I wouldn't personally go so far as to harbor fantasies of liberating bots, rather than analyzing the transfer that happens between the history of enslavement, deanimation, etc., in the nexus to technology, to machines, etc. But you are also the artist and the theorist.
Yeah, I have the privilege to liberate whatever I like in the artwork. No, but yeah, I think the alienation part of it is very important to look at.
Great. Let's leave it at that.
Wrap up here. Yeah. Thanks for the conversation. It was very interesting.
Thank you, Alex, for the many conversations we had, and to be continued.
Yeah.